Macro photography can be wildly fascinating. It's amazing how interesting all the small things around you can be when you start doing macro photography. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how you can get into macro photography. Everything you need to know to get started is Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. This week we're talking about macro photography. Now this is a really wildly interesting type of photography. It's essentially all about photographing the small or photographing things extremely close up and making them much bigger. And it is unbelievably interesting. If you've never tried it before, it's going to blow your mind how interesting just everyday, completely ordinary, normally uninteresting products and items can be. Now, a lot of people obviously like to photograph things like bugs or flowers, but you can really photograph almost anything when it comes to macro photography. You've always got a subject to photograph, and that's what I love about it the most. So let's get into what you're going to need, how you're going to do it, all the things you need to know to get into macro photography. So first off, let's just describe exactly what macro photography is. Technically speaking, macro photography is when the actual size of an item is replicated 1-to-1 on the sensor or bigger. So for example, if you've got, let's say, a tiny little berry, actually in the real world, if you photograph that and the size of the berry on the sensor is at least 1-to-1 with the size of the actual berry, that is macro photography. It can be bigger, it could be 2-to-1, you can have it twice the size of the sensor as it is in real life, but technically speaking, that's what macro photography is. Now, you don't need to worry really about that. Macro photography generally, for a lot of people, just sort of refers to photographing really small things close up. So just making the small world much larger. And you really can photograph anything this way. So that's essentially what we're doing when we're doing macro photography. Bugs, flowers, anything like mini cheddars, your computer, your phone screen, really anything can be photographed close up, and essentially that becomes macro photography. So what are you going to need to do this? Well, if you try and do this sort of thing with just an ordinary lens, let's say a kit lens that comes with the camera, or 24-70 or a 50mm f1.8, a nifty 50, you'll notice that you just can't get close enough to be able to do that. And that's because lenses have a minimum close focusing distance. That means that there's a minimum distance that they can go to be able to focus on a subject. Let's say it's 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters. That means you are a decent distance away from the subject. It's not going to be replicated that big size. You're not going to get in really close up. Whereas macro lenses are specifically designed to have a very close focusing distance, allowing you to get in nice and close to your subject and really get that detail, that interesting photo of an extremely close up shot of whatever it is you're photographing. So the first thing you want to look for is a macro lens of some kind. Now they come in different types of focal lengths. You don't have to worry too much about that. I like to go for a longer focal length, so something like 105mm. I really like that because it'll double up for other things. We'll talk about that a bit later in the video. But essentially a lens with macro capabilities is going to allow you to focus very close and shoot really close up on all kinds of things. So with a macro lens on your camera, one of the first things you're going to notice when you first go to try and do this is that you have an incredibly shallow depth of field. The combination of either a long focal length, or even if it is a bit of a shorter focal length, but being so close up to your subject is going to give you a very shallow depth of field. This can be a very difficult thing to overcome, especially at first when you first start doing macro photography. It means there are two things that you really need to think about when you're doing this. The first one, of course, is focusing. Now, some cameras are going to be able to autofocus quite well for macro photography, but for the most part, you're probably going to be better off using manual focus. You can pop on focus peaking if your camera supports that, which can be really helpful, but otherwise this is going to be a little bit of trial and error. This is going to be a case of setting your camera in place and just twisting that manual focus wheel very slowly until you get the nice detail in the right place. Now, if this is a bug, you're going to want to focus on its eyes. If this is a flower, you're going to want to make sure you have the correct part in focus. There's nothing worse than getting the photo back onto your computer later and realizing you missed focus. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can really help with this. The first is, let's pop that camera onto a tripod, whether it's a full-size tripod or a mini tripod, which is generally what I use for macro photography. That's going to really help with keeping the camera in one position, because when you're talking about such a fine, shallow depth of field, Just the movement of your camera in your hands can really affect that focus. So a tripod here is really, really helpful for keeping that stability and consistency when it comes to the depth of field. That way you can pop it on, start doing your manual focus, and you don't have to worry about the camera moving even a tiny bit backwards or forwards. A tripod is also going to help for a few different reasons. When you're talking about such a close-up shot, especially if it's something like a 105mm lens, something like that, and you're so focused in on something very close, you are probably going to notice a lot more camera shake than you normally would. So popping on the tripod kind of gets rid of that. That means you're not going to get blurry photos from the camera kind of shaking ever so slightly. We can also try to compensate for that extremely shallow depth of field by stopping down the aperture. So I usually shoot macro photos somewhere around f11 because that allows me to get a slightly deeper depth of field. Now you're still going to have a very shallow depth of field realistically, but it is going to allow you a little bit more leeway with that depth of field, and it generally looks much better for your photo. And that leads us on to our second problem, which is light. If you're stopping down to f11, you probably have a reasonably dark exposure. Now there's times when that won't be true. If you're shooting outdoors in the bright sun, if it's really bright, f11 is going to be absolutely fine. However, if you start trying to bring that shutter speed up to something reasonably fast, you're going to find you're going to have to bump that ISO up as well. That's where our tripod comes back in. With the tripod, with the camera set on that, we don't have to worry so much about having a fast shutter speed to offset things like camera shake or anything like that. If you're indoors, you can afford to have a slower shutter speed. Now, the reason I say indoors is because that way there's almost definitely no wind, things aren't moving around, and whatever you're photographing is probably staying very still. Whether it's a plant, whether it is a bug that's indoors, it hopefully is staying very still. That's going to make your life a lot easier, but you can photograph anything at all. And as long as it's not moving, you can bring that shutter speed down to something like even a second, 2 seconds, whatever you need to do to allow more light in to capture that photo. Now, another little tip that you can use just to make sure you don't have any shake or blur in your photo, pop a little 2-second timer on so that when you press the shutter, the camera just goes for a 2-second timer, then takes the photo. That way you'll get no shake from actually pressing the shutter to take the photo. But what if you're going to take the photo outdoors, or if it's of a moving subject? Well, if you're taking the photo outdoors of, let's say, a flower, there's a chance there'll be a little bit of wind, just enough to move the flower and blur the photo. This is where you'll need to use a faster shutter speed. Now, if it's a very bright day, you might get lucky, pop your camera on the tripod still, but you might get lucky and be able to use 1/200th of a second at f11 without having to bring that ISO up too much. But otherwise, you've really got two options. You're going to have to bump that ISO up, 1600, 3200, 6400. It's not the end of the world, but it does start to introduce a little bit of digital noise. The other alternative is to use some kind of lighting. Now, there's a few options here. You could use flash, you can use continuous lighting. I tend to use continuous lighting, but a lot of people will find flash a lot easier to work with. Flash is also a little bit kinder, especially if you're shooting bugs and stuff like that, because a continuous light will often create a lot of heat, which is not so pleasant for the bug. So a flash is a much better solution if you're shooting bugs. If it's something that's still, if it's not an animal, if it's not a bug, I like to use continuous light just because I can see exactly what I'm doing with the light. I can set it up exactly how I want to, and I can see it before I take the photo, before I have to test the flash, if you like. That's something that you can do indoors as well. If you don't want to use a 1, 2, 3 second exposure, you can use continuous lighting or a flash to actually get enough light to actually light your subject. Those are always going to be the two biggest challenges when it comes to macro photography, is lighting and focusing. And the easiest way to get good at this is literally just to practice, to take a number of photos per subject. So because we're not in the film days anymore, because we're in the digital days, and as long as you don't have a 2GB SD card, you can take lots and lots of photos of your subject. And that's the way to get better at doing this sort of thing. So focus on your subject, take the photo, defocus it, then focus again, take the photo, defocus, and keep going. And when you come to look at them on the computer, you can see, okay, I can see I was getting better, or I was getting worse, or this one worked better than the other ones. And you can slowly, hopefully, try to learn that skill of focusing really well and be able to see what works either on the back LCD screen of your camera or through the viewfinder or whatever it is that you're using. Same thing goes for your exposure. Try the same photo, the same subject, but using two different ways of exposing. Try a long exposure. So 5 seconds, for example, as your shutter speed to let lots and lots of light in. And then try a higher ISO value and see which one works better for you. Maybe you find that that long exposure didn't work as well because it was letting in a lot of light, yes, but you did have a little bit of blurring where the subject was moving, where the wind was moving something. Something wasn't quite right. Or maybe you find that high ISO doesn't work well for you because it does introduce too much noise and you want that detail to be nice and clean. The only way you're going to know for sure, and the only way you're going to be able to get better at it, is to just keep taking those photos. So try the 2 different exposure types on the same subject. Now, one of the biggest tips that I would give for getting started with macro photography like this is to start small, no pun intended, but start with an easier subject. If you go in trying to photograph ants or something like that, it's going to be really difficult because they move fast, focusing is going to be hard, actually getting enough light in, you're going to have a fast shutter speed. That's going to be a difficult thing to photograph when it comes to macro photography, whereas still objects within your house are going to be much, much easier. Still set your camera up on the tripod, but the subject is not going to move. So you really have the opportunity to try out a few different things. You can photograph almost anything with a macro lens, and I guarantee to you, it'll be more interesting than you think. For example, this is a mini cheddar taken extremely close up. This is the front of my computer grid. This is actually the dust grid. Now those tolls are tiny. They're supposed to stop dust getting in, but close up it looks really, really interesting. This is my cracked and smashed phone screen. I have had it repaired, so don't worry about that. But this is all cracked and smashed, and close up again, this is really, really interesting to see. This is just a photo, a close-up photo of part of a lens that I have. And you can see if I show you the kind of wider shot, it's a really interesting look, and you can see the texture is completely different. Everything is completely different about the photo. It's so wildly fascinating, to be honest, to shoot things macro style because you see things in a totally different way. Now, one thing I will mention, which I briefly alluded to earlier in the video, is sometimes you might think to yourself, I don't want to spend all that money on a macro lens when it's a pretty niche type of photography. I'm not sure I'm going to do it that often. I don't know that I want a dedicated macro lens. And I hear you. I totally understand because I've been there myself. I've thought that exact thing. But macro lenses are really quite special because while yes, they allow you to take these lovely macro close-up photos, they also double up as fantastic portrait lenses. They are really, really good for that. Let's take a 105mm f2.8 as an example. Yes, great macro option. Yes, allows you to get really lovely close-up shots, but it works so well as a portrait lens. I would actually use it like that, probably more than I would use it for the macro stuff. They work really well as a good kind of all-rounder lens because it's a reasonably long focal length, but there's lots of stuff you can photograph like that. Street photography, landscape, there's loads of stuff you can do with a focal length like that. f2.8 is nice and bright, so you can get some nice depth of field, some nice light into your camera, but you've also got the capability of doing these macro shots. So they kind of double up in this way of creating all kinds of different content. So actually, a macro lens is the kind of lens that, yes, you get and you think about doing macro stuff, but it never really actually leaves your side. It's always one you take out with you because it can do so many different things. It can be a really, really useful lens to have in your bag. Now, we've really just done sort of a getting started with a kind of beginner's guide to macro photography there. There's lots that we could talk about. Some of the images people are able to capture with macro stuff is absolutely outstanding. So if you'd like a more full, in-depth tutorial all about macro stuff, let me know down in the comments. I'll pop a bunch of different macro lenses, links to them down in the description so you can go and check them out for yourself. They come in all different price ranges, so it's really interesting to check that kind of stuff out. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe because there's new content all the time. I'll be seeing you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.